Welcome to Mindset Matters Book Club YouTube channel. Please subscribe and like to hear new book summaries. Today, we're doing a deep dive into a really fascinating book, one that makes you rethink the whole purpose of college in America. It's called Invented: How an American Tradition of Innovation Can Transform College Today by Caroline Levander. And she starts with this brilliant and kind of unsettling question, especially for you navigating this world of constant change. Are today's universities basically a museum? You know, a place that just collects and passes down old knowledge.
Or are they a startup?
Exactly, a startup,
Yeah.
a mission-obsessed incubator that's all about creating these inventive habits of thought.
And that tension, the museum versus the startup, is just so critical right now. I mean, if you're concerned not just with, getting by, but actually thriving in a world that's being totally reshaped by new tech and huge cultural shifts, this book makes a powerful case. It argues that the American university has kind of suffered because it's tried to pick one over the other.
Right, it's tried to be either the museum or the startup.
Yeah, and to really ensure our national vitality, our economic future, the university has to be both. It needs to be that museum preserving deep foundational knowledge and a startup, fostering that adaptive, creative ability to synthesize things in new ways.
So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack that central argument, the idea that American universities have sort of accidentally, over the last century, failed to intentionally cultivate the very inventive mindset that defined the nation's biggest successes.
It's a huge task she lays out for all 4,000 U.S. colleges. In about 120 credit hours, you have to instill deep competence in a specific field, but also this inventive, adaptive, cross-disciplinary, creative capacity. It's an enormous challenge.
And historically, it seems like academic leaders weren't even on board with the startup part of that mission.
Not at all. The book shows how they often just dismissed it. You see it with figures like William Watts Folwell, who was the president of the University of Minnesota over a century ago. He famously declared that, I'm quoting here, "Great ideas, great inventions, great systems or works do not arise within academic walls."
Wow. So he was basically saying, that's not our job.
Pretty much. They wanted the pure museum model. They were focused on transmitting the established European intellectual tradition, and they were afraid that all this messy, practical invention would somehow corrupt the pure pursuit of knowledge.
So the academic structure itself became the first major hurdle. It sounds like we need to reclaim a forgotten method of invention that was uniquely American, and then figure out how to weave it back into the system. So let's start there in part one. What was this foundational method that the Academy later forgot?
Well, the foundational invention, interestingly enough, was the method itself. It was this highly pragmatic, deeply cross-disciplinary approach to discovery. The whole thing depended on an inventor's ability to just move opportunistically across different fields, arts, sciences, technology, whatever was needed.
So invention wasn't about creating something out of thin air.
No, not at all. It was defined as putting existing components, existing ideas, and existing tools into new and unorthodox combinations. And this was really born out of necessity. You had this vast, untamed American frontier, and at the same time, very limited access to established European resources.
So necessity really was the mother of invention, but the invention was the system of thinking you needed to survive and build something new. You mentioned the European view. Why did places like Oxford and Paris, these big 19th century institutions, why did they look down on this American approach?
Well, they dismissed it as, frankly, crude. It lacked theoretical purity. It didn't have the right academic, bona fides. They saw the Americans as just tinkerers and technicians, not as true scholars engaged in pure thought. Early American inventors didn't have access to those established institutions, so they had to rely on this mix of self-teaching, whatever books they could get their hands on, and, this is the key part, an incredibly sharp observational aptitude for the vast unknown of the New World.
That's a huge distinction. The American archetype wasn't the scholar locked away in an ivory tower. It was the self-taught scientist/inventor who combined rigorous mastery of existing knowledge with this intense on-the-ground attention to the environment. The sheer scale of the American wilderness, plus the urgent need for practical solutions, it just forced this cross-pollination. It was invention happening in the field.
And no one embodies this method better than Benjamin Franklin. The book really puts him under the microscope, not just as a political figure, but as the architect and really the global ambassador for this entire intellectual tradition.
The praise he got from European thinkers really drives that home, doesn't it? I'm thinking of the French economist Turgot, who said Franklin snatched the lightning from the sky and the scepter from tyrants.
Exactly. He was recognizing that Franklin was behind two revolutions at once, one political, one intellectual. And the German philosopher Immanuel Kant took it even further. He called Franklin the world's new Prometheus because he took this terrifying force of nature fire, lightning, and turned it into systematic knowledge with the lightning rod.
But what's so fascinating is how he got there. I mean, the man was a grade school dropout. He left formal school at age 10 and, by his own admission, failed at math his whole life.
Wait, a scientific giant who couldn't do math? That completely undermines the modern story that you have to be a STEM genius to make a discovery.
Absolutely. And the book argues his method was actually developed through his literary career. As a writer and a printer, his whole skill set was about mimicry, about blending different worldviews for rhetorical effect, and having this incredible eye for detail in observing people and nature. He then applied those exact skills, that ability to synthesize disparate ideas, directly to his study of electricity.
So he didn't stop being a writer to become a scientist. He used his literary and rhetorical mind as his method for invention.
That reframes everything. His huge discovery of charge conservation, the fundamental idea that electric charge isn't created or destroyed, just transferred, that came directly from solving the very practical, immediate problem of lightning hitting buildings.
Yes. It shows how this practical attitude, this willingness to combine knowledge from totally different areas, literature, mechanics, natural philosophy, led directly to a universal law of science. It wasn't pure research for its own sake. It was a theoretical breakthrough that was driven by a really practical need.
And this Franklinian method, this cross-disciplinary approach, was then explicitly picked up by later inventors, who the book calls the poet inventors. Robert Fulton is a great example. We think of him for the steamboat, but he started out as a portrait painter.
And that artistic background was his secret weapon. Fulton succeeded with steam navigation where so many other engineers had failed because he brought a trained artist's eye for aesthetics, for form, for proportion to a mechanical problem. His whole philosophy was explicit about this. He said the mechanic should sit among levers and wheels, like a poet among the letters of the alphabet, creating a new arrangement to transmit a new idea.
Wow, like a poet among the letters of the alphabet. He saw machine parts as a language to be composed.
Exactly. He looked at the components with the compositional structural eye of a poet, not just the cold objectivity of a specialized engineer. It was a total fusion of art and mechanics.
We see the same pattern with Samuel Morse, the inventor of the telegraph. He was primarily a painter, and a really good one.
And Morse was very conscious that he was following in Franklin's footsteps. There's this massive 1862 painting by Christian Schussel called Men of Progress, which celebrates all these American inventors. And in it, Benjamin Franklin's portrait is up on the wall, looking down, almost approvingly, right over Samuel Morse.
So it was visually coding him as Franklin's heir.
Yes, as the direct intellectual successor, the one who successfully blended an artistic career with the development of electric communication. The message was unmistakable. Combining art and science wasn't just a quirky habit of these guys. It's what made their inventions possible, what made them great.
So the whole method depended on this broad, diverse skill set. But here's the dark twist the book gets into. Even though the method relied on diversity, the public image of the inventor quickly became incredibly biased.
Precisely. The phenotype of the inventor very quickly became white and male, and that obscured the reality of all this hidden labor and discrimination. The public story that celebrated Franklin, Morse, and later Edison, it created this powerful myth for the nation, but it actively pushed so many other diverse contributions into the shadows.
And this wasn't just social pressure, right? This was actually written into the law, making the erasure systemic. Can you talk about the patent laws?
Oh, absolutely. The book points to this really damning ruling from the U.S. Commissioner of Patents in 1857, which stated explicitly that inventions by slaves could not be patented. The impact of that was just profound and long-lasting. It legally funneled discoveries made by black inventors into the hands of their white owners, which cemented this false narrative that invention was a white man's game.
It was a legal tool to erase contributions.
It completely undercut the race-neutral language that was in the Constitution's patent clause. It ensured that both the economic and the intellectual credit for these contributions were obscured for generations.
And it wasn't just about race. We forget about the brilliant women who were innovating and just constantly fighting against the structural sexism of the time.
Totally. The book brings up people like Tabitha Babbitt, a Shaker woman who invented the circular saw back in 1813, or Sarah Mather, who patented the submarine telescopes and lamp in 1845. These discoveries were happening, but they were outside the official sanctioned narrative. Martha Costin is another incredible example. She developed this crucial system of pyrotechnic signaling flares that the U.S. Navy bought.
But she had to hide her identity to do it.
She had to use a male pseudonym, J.C. Costin, in all her letters with the Navy. Why? Because she was terrified they would just dismiss a woman inventor out of hand. The headwind of discrimination was so ingrained that it actively handicapped the credibility and obscured the critical contributions of diverse creators, often at the nation's own expense.
So the core paradox is that the American method, when it's working best, relies on blending the most different kinds of knowledge, skills, and perspectives, but the mythology that was built around it actively limited whose voices got heard and supported.
And that's the book's core thesis right there. The deployment of diverse skills and diverse voices is the key to American invention's success. The country simply cannot realize its full creative potential without inclusion. When you shut down diversity of thought, of background, of identity, you are shrinking the pool of unorthodox combinations that make discovery possible. The exclusion wasn't just a moral failure, it was structurally anti-inventive.
That's a powerful way to put it. Structural bias is intellectual self-sabotage. So if the early republic was defined by this radical, necessary cross-pollination, how on earth did the university system, in its quest for legitimacy, manage to destroy that very method? Let's get into part 2. The two-culture divide and how it eroded that inventive capacity.
Well, the shift really kicks off in the late 19th century, and it's driven by this deep-seated sense of inferiority. American universities knew they didn't have the global stature of the big European institutions, so they started looking abroad for a model to copy. After the Civil War, thousands of ambitious Americans went to Europe, especially to German research universities like Berlin and Göttingen, for advanced study.
And what they brought back with them was the German research model, which was fantastic for raising scholarly standards, but it was fundamentally the opposite of that Franklinian hands-on approach.
Exactly. The German model prioritized this ideal of Wissenschaft, pure intellectual pursuits, and deep, deep specialization. This was the polar opposite of the American colonial context. The colonists valued curiosity that was tied to practical outcomes. The German model valued specialization and theoretical abstraction. The belief was that pure knowledge would eventually trickle down into practical use, but that the academy itself should stay above the fray, away from the messiness of application.
And the person who really institutionalized this shift in America was Charles Eliot. His 40-year presidency at Harvard, starting in 1869, basically created the specialized modern university structure we still have today.
Eliot's reform, which he called the New Education, was a massive institutional invention in its own right. He completely moved away from the old classical uniform curriculum, where everyone had to take Latin, Greek, moral philosophy, and he pushed aggressively towards specialization. This is what gave us the modern system of required courses, structured majors, and the totally revolutionary concept of the elective.
But wait, if Eliot created the first fine arts department at Harvard, wasn't he trying to balance the arts and sciences? Where exactly did his model go wrong in fostering that inventive mindset?
That's the critical question, and it's a subtle one. Eliot did intend for there to be parity between the arts and sciences, but the institutional structure he built was inherently flawed. By creating specialized departments, each with its own budget, its own building, its own metrics for success, his model effectively decoupled them. By institutional design, discovery was now seen as happening through this single-minded, isolated immersion within a disciplinary silo. Chemistry happened in the chemistry building, history in the history building.
So the department silo became a literal and intellectual wall. And the cross-training muscle you need for invention, that ability to courageously move across boundaries, it just started to atrophy for undergrads who were locked into these rigid major requirements.
Precisely. And this structural separation was later given a name by C.P. Snow in his famous 1959 lecture. He's the one who coined the term two cultures to describe this mutual suspicion and complete lack of comprehension that had grown between the science and engineering departments on one side and the arts and humanities on the other.
And Snow's whole point was that the most creative breakthroughs happen at the clashing point of two subjects. So if the university structure was actively preventing those clashes, it was essentially guaranteeing incremental progress instead of truly disruptive innovation.
And you could see students feeling it. They were streamed into tracks early on. The rigid major requirements meant that a budding physicist would rarely have any meaningful interaction with the history or literature curriculum, beyond ticking a box for a general education requirement. Those moments of creative chance, like Einstein saying his breakthrough in relativity came to him while playing a Mozart sonata, Those were becoming structurally impossible for students.
You can even see this institutional bias playing out in hybrid fields. The book uses economics as a prime example of how academic legitimacy started to lean decisively toward the scientific side of things.
Right? The book shows that what we now call the social sciences, sociology, history, economics, they were the last to get organized in the American Academy. And they had a choice to make. Do we emphasize the social, philosophical, human side of our work, or do we emphasize the scientific rigor? To get power and authority in Eliot's new specialized system, they strategically chose to underscore the science part of their work.
I always forget that when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, he wasn't an economist, he was a moral philosopher. The European tradition of economics was deeply tied to ethics and sociology.
Exactly. But in the American context, these new departments, especially economics, they purposefully started associating themselves with hyper-scientific methods.
Yeah.
They prioritized rationality, advanced mathematics, predictive modeling. They actively shrugged off the philosophical, ethical, and sociological elements. Their models often refused to account for, human emotion or variability, purely to assert their dominance and align with the rising institutional power of the hard sciences.
That constant push for scientific credibility led to the hierarchy we see in the term social science itself, where science is the important noun and social, the human part, is just a modifier. The message coming from the university in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was crystal clear. Science was the most important team on the field. It offered the highest intellectual status and, increasingly, the most funding.
And that leads us straight into the 20th century, where federal priorities just cemented science's dominance, creating what we now call big science, and further eroding that old method of cross-pollination. Let's dig into that in part 3.
Right, because the success of war-related research during 2 world wars just completely changed the game. The sheer amount of funding and, of course, the technical achievement of the Manhattan Project gave scientists this unprecedented public respect. And they leveraged that successfully into massive ongoing research support after 1945. Universities went from being these quiet training grounds to being vital engines of national security.
The foundational document for this whole transformation was Vannevar Bush's landmark report, Science, The Endless Frontier, which came out in 1945. This report was basically the U.S. government committing to a permanent scientific infrastructure even in peacetime.
And the book points out how Bush argued that science was absolutely essential for national security and that it should be the universities, not corporate labs, that conduct the basic, curiosity-driven research.
He completely redefined the whole idea of the American frontier. The geographic wilderness frontier that Franklin and Fulton had explored was being replaced by a scientific endless frontier. But this new frontier, unlike the old one, had to be conquered indoors, inside the controlled, specialized environment of the research lab. This commitment funneled billions of dollars into science and engineering departments, and that created this huge power imbalance within the university.
But here's where it gets so interesting. Even Bush, the guy who designed big science, he saw the potential danger in all this hyper-specialization, didn't he?
He absolutely did. He worried that the, quote, growing complexity of life tends to make men cogs. He was lamenting that the lone researcher, that Franklin-like figure who could follow his curiosity, inspired by poetry or philosophy, was being pushed aside by the need for specialized, deliverable-driven outcomes that were necessary for these huge federal projects. He was genuinely alarmed that America's most brilliant scientists were becoming, in his words, uninterested in the rest of the world.
It's like a moment of intellectual whiplash. The same year he publishes the report that solidifies big science, he publishes a totally separate article in The Atlantic called As We May Think, where he basically invents a technological concept to fight the very problem his research model was creating.
Yes, he realized that knowledge was piling up faster than anyone could possibly organize or synthesize it. Bush saw the intellectual bottleneck that was being caused by information overload and hyperspecialization. So he proposed the MIMEX, a memory expansion machine, as a technological fix, an aid for associative thinking to help researchers integrate artistic and scientific knowledge.
This was basically a desk-sized analog version of the internet and hyperlinking, right?
Totally. He wanted a device that would automatically help a researcher do what the early American inventors did naturally, make these associative trails across vast amounts of previously unrelated information. The book notes that modern innovators, people like Douglas Engelbart, who pioneered the computer mouse, and Marc Andreessen, who created the first big web browser, they all point to Bush's vision as being foundational. The Memex was this desperate attempt to use technology to bring back the lost art of cross-disciplinary thinking that the university's structure was making impossible.
So science got all the money and the institutional power, but the humanities still managed to play this unexpected, vital role in the Cold War, especially after World War II.
They played a crucial role, even if they didn't get the funding. After the horrors of WWII, there was this profound philosophical reckoning. A lot of people argued that specialized scientific knowledge alone couldn't explain human brutality. It couldn't provide the moral framework needed to, inoculate citizens against future totalitarian regimes. The argument that emerged was that literature, philosophy, and history, they enlarge what technology can't perceive. Human particularity, love, honor, moral complexity.
And this is why we see creative writing programs, like the famous ones at Stanford and the University of Iowa, really start to take root and gain intellectual credibility.
They were founded explicitly on the idea that the artist needed to be at the heart of the university as a kind of intellectual defense. Wallace Stegner, one of the founders of the Stanford program, argued that literature was a crucial asset for democracy, that it could counter the uniformity that totalitarian regimes promoted. He was building on Hannah Arendt's idea that totalitarianism's main enemy was individuality, indeed anything that distinguishes one man from another. The humanities, therefore, were providing an essential defense against ideological threats.
Even science fiction got in on the act, influencing the hard sciences.
Yes, writers like Ray Bradbury were called the poet laureate of space exploration. The actual scientists and engineers in the space program, like Wernher von Braun, they credited sci-fi authors with seeing it all ahead of us. It just proves that the traditional inventive method blending imaginative arts with specialized sciences, it still worked, just on a much bigger, federally funded scale. The key difference, though, was that the humanities contributions were seen as inspirational or ideological, not something tied to a direct market opportunity.
And market opportunity is what completely redefined the university, starting in the 1970s. This is when we enter the era of the market university.
This was driven by a perfect storm. You had the economic downturns of the 70s, tuition revenue was flagging, and then you had these crucial federal policy changes, most importantly, the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980. This policy fundamentally changed the game by encouraging universities to patent and sell the science that was produced on their campuses.
Okay, we have to pause on Bayh-Dole for a second. Why was that act such a massive turning point in this museum versus startup dynamic?
Well, before Bayh-Dole, if you developed an invention using federal research money, which was most basic science, the government typically owned the patent. This made commercialization really slow and complicated. Bayh-Dole flipped the script completely. It allowed universities, nonprofits, and small businesses to keep ownership of the intellectual property that came from federally funded research. This instantly turned the university into an engine for commercial opportunity. It created this direct, powerful financial incentive to scale up research that led to patentable discoveries.
And that's when you start to see these huge institution-changing success stories. The book talks about Genentech, which was founded in '76 by an academic scientist. It was the perfect example of academic science meeting venture capital.
And the money was just staggering. Columbia University earned something like $790 million from its co-transformation patents, a key process for cloning genes. Yale made over $250 million from an HIV drug developed on campus. These were like research lottery wins, and they attracted these huge new streams of funding that went disproportionately to the top 60 or so research-intensive universities, creating this winner-take-all environment in academic science.
The success made the university start to look and act like a business. It sounds like this is the moment the corporate university was truly born.
It was inevitable. Universities started copying business practices to manage and maximize this new revenue. Students were increasingly treated like customers who were looking for a return on investment. University presidents started acting like CEOs, and the focus shifted heavily toward demonstrable, market-ready deliverables. The startup dynamic, driven by the desire to monetize, just completely overshadowed the museum's role of preserving and cross-pollinating general knowledge.
But wait, if the book is all about promoting invention, why is the rise of the market university seen as a negative thing? Didn't the Bayh-Dole Act lead to more inventions?
It led to more market-ready inventions, yes, but at a huge cost to the underlying infrastructure of innovation. By putting almost all the investment into fields that led to immediate commercial products, so late-stage science, biotech, engineering, the university inadvertently starved the infrastructure that was needed for the really substantial disruptive discoveries.
Because the truly disruptive stuff, by its very nature, happens at that messy, unexpected intersection of wildly different fields. The very kind of knowledge synthesis that the specialized, market-driven university no longer had the time or money to support.
Exactly. The university clarified its economic value to the nation. It became an IP generator. But in doing so, it limited its potential for the truly radical, unorthodox breakthroughs that required deep investment in what seemed like uncommercial fields.
That sets the stage perfectly for the modern crisis we see in undergraduate education. If the current system is optimized for specialization and market deliverables, how do we fix it? How do we reclaim that inventive mindset? Let's move to part 4, the path forward.
The need for change is just so urgent. We're in a period of such rapid flux, and the data is all pointing in one direction. The World Economic Forum, LinkedIn, they all consistently rank creativity, which they define as the ability to look at problems from different angles and find new solutions, as a top skill for success. Especially now, with AI that can replicate competence and data accumulation, human success is all about synthesis and creative capacity.
But there's this huge gap. Despite all the emphasis on STEM, American students' attainment of essential knowledge in math and reading has basically flatlined since the early 2010s. And that Gallup survey finding is just brutal. Only 34% of students feel like they leave college with the skills they actually need to succeed.
And the core problem, the book argues, it starts way before college. K-12 education is so focused on competence accumulation and standardized tests, it just rigidly reinforces this idea of the one right answer. This means freshmen are showing up on campus inherently uncomfortable with risk, with uncertainty, with crossing boundaries. To fight this, the revised Bloom's taxonomy of learning now puts creativity, the ability to combine parts to make a new whole, at the very top of the intellectual pyramid, finally replacing evaluation. The educational winds have to start blowing in that direction from day one of college.
So the first critical step, step 1, has to be developing a growth mindset. It's like the oxygen that creativity needs to breathe.
The shift has to be away from a maintaining posture, just preparing students for jobs that already exist, to a creating posture, positioning students to build new things, to see opportunities others miss, and to solve these messy, unpredictable problems. And that requires a type of teaching that actively tackles the fixed mindset that makes students afraid to fail. You have to make productive failure a comfortable part of the learning process.
But how do you actually do that on a massive scale, across 4,000 different institutions, without creating a bunch of new, expensive programs?
The book suggests using the infrastructure that's already there. One really effective way is through teaching centers, which most campuses have, to scale this growth mindset adoption across all the disciplines, not just in the sciences. But the most important practical step is to integrate real-world, hands-on, project-based problem-solving with problems sourced directly from local businesses and community organizations.
So you mean finding actual pain points and real-world stumbling blocks from the community and then assigning student teams to try and solve them?
Exactly. This gives them practical experience in solving problems that don't have a clean, single answer. It forces students to operate in that gray area between disciplines. And suddenly, the relevance of a skill becomes obvious. If you're a student trying to optimize a delivery route for a local nonprofit, the need for math, for persuasive writing, for data analysis, it becomes self-evident. It's not just an abstract requirement anymore.
It shifts the whole focus from just collecting credit hours to demonstrating actual learning outcomes that are tied to solving a real problem. It's a lot harder to say, I'm not good at math, when you can see exactly how it helps you solve something tangible right in front of you.
Which brings us to step 2, celebrating disciplinary diversity. These are the actual ingredients you need for that creative mix. If creativity is all about combination, then you need a huge disciplinary terrain to roam, using all these specialized fields as the building blocks for unexpected connections.
This goes back to what you called the entangled bank of disciplines. Why is it so important for universities to protect and support the full range of knowledge, even the fields that seem costly or, esoteric?
Because they are the necessary ingredients for a robust inventive capacity. We have to remember the argument that W.E.B. Du Bois made about education for formerly enslaved people. Du Bois insisted that education had to be for human culture, not just for breadwinning. He argued fiercely against purely vocational schools that would only teach labor skills but not unlock a person's full human potential.
That famous line of his, the purpose of education is not simply to make men carpenters, it is to make carpenters men.
It's such a powerful defense of a true liberal education. Du Bois argued that to achieve your full intellectual potential, to achieve equality, you need access to the full, rich, entangled bank of university disciplines. He saw the university itself as a human invention for the transmission of knowledge and culture. If you limit that knowledge bank, you limit human culture, and that inevitably limits invention.
And Levander's book shows this with modern examples, right? That these esoteric fields are just as vital to success today as they were for Fulton and Morse.
Oh, there's so much evidence suggesting that the kind of abstract pattern recognition and critical analysis you get from the humanities is crucial for scientific synthesis. Look at Susan Wojcicki, the founder of Google's incubator. She was a history and literature major. Or the Nobel laureate Harold Varmus, who explicitly said that much of his scientific success came from the training he got as an English major. Walter Isaacson concluded that the truest creativity, the future of invention, it has to come from those who are able to connect the arts and sciences in these weird, unexpected ways.
So the challenge isn't to get rid of specialization or the museum function. It's to reintegrate the museum's vast collection in a way that fuels the startup function.
Exactly. Committing to protect the full range and diversity of specialized knowledge, even if it looks costly on a budget spreadsheet this quarter, it's an investment in the national infrastructure that supports our whole innovation culture. We have to stop these tired zero-sum arguments about the value of one field versus another and just recognize that all disciplines, in their complexity, are essential building blocks for making inventive connections.
That brings us to step 3, creating a creativity-inducing infrastructure. What are the immediate, low-cost institutional tweaks that can create the connective tissue for this cross-pollination to happen for undergraduates?
The focus has to be on early intervention. You have to start at the very beginning of the student journey before that fixed mindset and those rigid curriculum choices really take hold. This doesn't require a new science building or a multi-million-dollar donation. It just requires intentional design.
Okay, give us some specific low-cost examples, things any college could do next semester.
Common reading programs that are focused on the theme of invention, not just the history of science, but the process of cross-pollination. That's an easy one to implement. Freshman orientation activities could ask students to explicitly connect two seemingly unrelated interests they came to college with. Or even simpler, faculty across the entire curriculum could encourage students to keep a journal where they detail how different courses, say a science class and a philosophy class, demand totally different ways of thinking and problem solving.
That last one seems especially powerful. It forces the student to become a kind of reflective anthropologist of their own learning process.
Exactly. It's about metacognition, being aware of how you know, not just what you know, but maybe the most abundant and most underutilized resource is the university's massive alumni network.
Right. Students usually only connect with alumni at the very end, when they're desperately looking for a job. How should that change?
The book suggests encouraging students to engage with alumni early in their education, to approach them as anthropologists or detectives who are searching for wisdom and adaptive career paths. This means asking different questions than just, can you hire me? They should be asking things like, what course did you take that seemed totally irrelevant at the time but turned out to be vital later on? Or how did you choose your major and what unexpected tool from another class did you actually end up using to solve a professional problem?
It models these adaptive career paths. It shows students how knowledge from all these different fields actually gets synthesized in the real world, just like it did for Franklin and Fulton and Morse. The alumni become this living, breathing, human archive of applied inventive thinking.
And these kinds of modest adjustments to how we do things, they aren't costly. They're easily scalable. And they allow institutions to measure success all without having to do a full-scale, politically impossible overhaul of the entire university. There are immediate actions that can start to rebuild that connective tissue that specialization destroyed.
Which takes us to the outro, the critical final step for American higher education.
Yeah.
Communication. Universities have to collectively advocate for this new model and publicly communicate its return on investment.
This is absolutely vital because public perception right now is grim. Recent surveys show this dramatic drop in public confidence. The share of Americans who think colleges have a positive impact on the country fell from 69% in 2020 to just 54% in 2024. Even the belief that a degree is a good financial return is slipping, especially when you factor in student debt.
And when you challenge higher ed leaders on their value, They often fall back on these weak defensive answers. They'll say, we develop well-rounded individuals, or we fulfill current workforce needs for data science or AI.
And those answers just aren't good enough anymore because they only offer incremental value. They're reactive, not proactive. The new value proposition has to replace those weak answers with the core, essential social contribution. The development of an inventive capability in all students that draws on the method used by the nation's greatest innovators. That has to be the public promise. That has to be the core mission.
So the ultimate definition of success isn't just getting a job right after graduation, because that job might not exist in 5 years. It's deep domain expertise combined with a proven creative ability to adapt and apply that knowledge in new, unpredictable situations. That's the long tradition of American invention, but leveraged for the 21st century.
And that pursuit of invention, it often involves intuition. It's what Nikola Tesla, that lone inventor who revolutionized electrical systems, called the finer fibers that go beyond purely logical knowledge. Tesla believed the mind is sharper and keener in seclusion, where originality thrived, free of outside influences. It suggests discovery requires more than just piling up facts.
But the humanities are essential for developing that intuition, that questioning mindset, the Socratic method, just relentless questioning until you expose a contradiction. That is the engine of critical thinking. It's what breaks apart our fixed assumptions.
But that Socratic posture, it runs completely counter to specialized problem solving, where the goal is usually to find the one right answer that the discipline dictates. It's an inherently dangerous position to take intellectually in a specialized world. We have to remember that Socrates himself was ultimately executed for corrupting the youth with his very inquisitive posture because his students started to challenge the entire establishment.
So, in a world that's driven by facts and certainty, and these specialized paths designed to give you an immediate market return, we have to ask ourselves the provocative question this book leaves us with. Are you willing to embrace the kind of relentless questioning and cross-pollination that might make you an intellectual outlier? Are you willing to risk being laughed at for blending the artistic and the scientific, knowing that our country's greatest leaps forward were made by the people who took that exact risk and defied the institutional boundaries of their time?
We have to remember what we've forgotten, that the method that emerged from the American context so long ago, that inventive capacity born of synthesis, it can, and it must be, intentionally taught in American higher education to foster discovery and an inventive mindset in all students. Our future national vitality, as the book demonstrates, really depends on it.
Indeed. Be an anthropologist of your own learning journey, take charge of your knowledge acquisition, and apply that deeply inventive mindset to your life today. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.